Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 750, April the 21st, 1986. I've done many broadcasts on Libya through the years. I was just looking back at some of the titles of them, going back from 1979, 1980, 1981. And there's so much material, there's no way that I can go back over and repeat a lot of that, because many of you regular subscribers have the cassettes from the air and get them through the mail of those particular broadcasts. I did update the Libyan story in March 31st, as a matter of fact, program number 747, on the Libyan confrontation and Ronald Reagan in the Gulf of Sidra, how he's provoking Muammar Gaddafi, and trying to give an overview of how complicated this event is in the Middle East. It isn't a matter of crossing a line of death over at Gulf of Sidra, and it isn't a matter of bombing a disco in Germany. The situation in Libya has been on the drawing boards for a long, long time, and now the president is ready to make his move against Muammar Gaddafi. I mentioned the conflict, the theory that Dr. Anthony Sutton has, the author from Stanford Institute. It's not only a theory, but it's been supported by evidence through the years about the conflict of right and left and the confusion over who is causing the problems in the world as against the actual facts as they exist. Now, William Wilson was in Libya. He has an oil company over there. He's an envoy for the president of the Vatican. He also has business interests there, and I will cite some more very concrete business context. And the problem with geography has as much to do with business, which includes the narcotics trade, as anything else, and it has to do with firms and contracts and oceans. And I cited Brown and Root and various large corporations, American corporations, the Occidental Petroleum. Arm & Hammer is a big wheel in Libya, getting the oil started for Muammar Gaddafi there. The control of each geographical area, as I see it, is a stepping stone towards World War III, and it is set up for whatever way we want it or to use it to our advantage, and then take it over so that the United States has all of these countries surrounding the Soviet Union and can prepare for what has been wanted since the Russian Revolution, actually, to wipe out Marxism and communism, take the vast resources of Russia for the large corporations, and make World War III. Now, starting in 1976, the, in quotes, terrorism of Gaddafi was educated and funneled to him by the intelligence system for a time when they later could knock him out, take his resources, and take the country. In October of 1980, October 21st, 1980, Jack Anderson had an article that I had on the air going back to that time titled U.S. Killer Know-How. And he said, American cloak and dagger operatives skilled in the dark arts have trained and equipped terrorist squads for Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, to promote world terrorism. Dozens of victims have been gunned down, hunted down, executed with cold efficiency of American know-how, which brought the murder profession out in the open to Gaddafi. One death squad was discovered in the United States, and it was expelled. According to Justice Department files, American experts have taught Gaddafi killers how to construct sophisticated booby traps that turn innocent objects, such as a book or a telephone or toothpaste, into murder weapons. The American ringleader, Frank Turple, even offered to smuggle into Libya a U.S. red-eye missile, a shoulder-launched, heat-seeking weapon that would bring down an airliner in flight. There are unconfirmed intelligence reports an Israeli airliner, which mysteriously exploded in the sky, was shot down with such a weapon by Gaddafi's terrorists. Incidentally, Frank Turple is still at large. He weaves in and out of areas such as the Caribbean and Cuba, along with Robert Vesco, who's very much part of this story. And Frank Turple was at Grenada shortly before the Americans invaded there and swept up and took that little island and killed Maurice Bishop. Frank Turple is still serving as a provocateur, and in the end, or always, it was that he was helping dictators, teaching Idi Amin how to torture, or Gaddafi how to blow up airplanes, to get an action so we can get a response. Jack Anderson wrote back in 1980, the fiery Gaddafi, who, a crucible of anger without focus, supports terrorist groups around the world from Ireland to Malaysia. Well, see, it's the terrorism that's going to allow the world dictatorship, so they arm Gaddafi to get ready to counteract his actions. The article says Libya publicly admits it gives training, weaponry, and funding to terrorist organizations throughout the world, specifically admitting the PLO, the Irish Republic Army, the Red Brigade, and the Japanese Red Army. And in those cases, the extreme right wing and the Knights of Malta and the Vatican and the fascist organizations are also setting up these organizations, and it appears they are from the left, and they are trained by our Marines, our CIA, and our Defense Department. Jack Anderson said the report revealed in the investigation was the supplying by United States firms of sophisticated timing devices, radio control devices, sensitive surveillance, communication equipment to unauthorized residents. Frank Terrorist met President Carter's brother, Billy Carter, in Libya and tried to set him up as a front for unsavory operations, and I'll do more on that later. Frank Terrorist agreed to train Libyan agents in espionage, sabotage, psychological warfare, as well as the design, manufacture, implementation, detonation of explosive devices. The undercover training was disguised as a mine-clearing operation. Now, keep in mind that this is all in the open. There's no secrets about this, how the Americans were training Gaddafi to become a terrorist. The fact that Edwin Wilson is in jail, a partner of Frank Terrorist, or George Corkla is in jail for a short while, doesn't matter at all, because they sent the weapons and taught how to kill and got what they wanted out of the area so that the multinationals could come in now and own Libya, own a port, this large area in the Mediterranean, and a foothold in Africa under the guise of stopping European terrorism. Jack Anderson said beginning in 1978, that was 1976 rather, in that early year, Terrorist himself, a CIA agent, recruited a team of American clandestine operatives, paramilitary specialists, professional killers, and explosive experts trained by the CIA and the United States Special Forces. And those Special Forces and the Green Berets are the ones that we want to send now down to Nicaragua to help the Contras. By August 1976, the Americans were ensconced grandly in the former winter palace of former Libyan King Idris, a luxurious hideaway that they assigned the curious code name Swanee. A palace room was turned into a workshop filled with diabolical devices the Libyan intelligence chief liked to take trusted friends on tours of secret rooms, show off deadly wares, and his American mercenaries. The visitors were impressed with the book bomb that detonated when it was open. Witnesses quoted a Libyan lieutenant as saying the devices were used to eliminate certain people because Gaddafi would feel more comfortable if they weren't around. At least one American quit the team because he felt innocent people eventually would get killed with the bombs. He didn't care about the military use of the devices, but he knew they were for terrorist use and innocent lives would be lost. And by 1977, the Americans delivered lethal flashlights, attaché cases, transistor radios, handheld calculators, refrigerators, all transformed into bombs, and they went to a Libyan colonel in Tobruk. So the United States should, instead of having a law against sending any of this stuff out of the country or putting in prison anyone for life that teaches terrorism, we don't do that because we need terrorism to get fascism. Now, in 1981, broadcast number 508 and 509, the week later, 510 and 511, 4 consecutive weeks in 1981, August and September, I did a lot of this story of Gaddafi, of the Middle East, and I don't want to repeat it again on the air. These tapes are available if you write to me and send a self-addressed envelope. I can tell you how to obtain them because I'm not going to repeat 4 hours for those people that do subscribe regularly. But I pointed out in one of the broadcasts, August 30th in 1981, that in 1977 the CIA started equipping Gaddafi with weapons to kill people, and it involved Theodore Shackley and Edwin Wilson, the same people that worked with the Nazis in Chile in Colonial Dignidad, that they were the far right. They weren't the left. If it was terrorism, it was made to look like the left, but Gaddafi, and these people were far right. Then I did a chronology of Ronald Reagan with Alexander Haig, lashing attacks at Gaddafi and linking him to Moscow, which is what is happening today and bringing us to the verge of on the way to World War III. In 1981, in July of 81, the House Intelligence Committee alerted Ronald Reagan of plans for Africa, and they also had information on the plans to kill Gaddafi that William Casey had to explain, and I'll go into that a little bit in a moment. This was in July 81, and now the newspaper is filled with stories of plans to kill Gaddafi. The CIA was going to overthrow Mauritania. Gaddafi was a big influence in Mauritius, and they had reasons to try to kill him then. The CIA was waiting till Ronald Reagan was reelected, and then they could do what they were planning to do. The plans to kill Gaddafi were evident in July and August of 1981. If you go to the library and look those up, and other articles of August 1981, CIA planning operations and what they were going to do for Egypt and Turkey, Pakistan, Guatemala, and so forth. As I say, I did quite a few broadcasts on Gaddafi and the Middle East because it would come again. It was important. It wasn't a problem that was solved. It was important for what would come again. On September 13th, 1981, that was broadcast 510, I had an item on some of the CIA corporations exporting assassins and equipments for terror. Now, these are CIA. One was the Egyptian American Transport and Services, which I'll do a lot more on, if not this evening, next week, about Mr. Thomas Cline's and the CIA money that first was going to Sadat, and then for the plan for the murder of Sadat that went into the hands of Mr. Mubarak, who now is soon going to be killed, and a military dictatorship will be set up in Egypt simultaneously with the death of Gaddafi. A far right-wing Nazi-type coup will take place there. I listed the companies, 6 companies that involved Edwin Wilson and Thomas Cline, Theodore Shackley, George Kokla, and the money that poured into this particular operation, the Swiss banks that were funding the Egyptian American Transport Services, and how Libya hires the CIA anti-Castro Cuban assassins for their jobs. And I asked the question, why is the U.S. Senate so quiet on this? And then I referred to a book many of you have or should get, Tom Davis, Research Carries It, by Paul Manning, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and it tells about the arrangement for Colonel Nasser of Egypt, how the CIA built him up, similar they did to Gaddafi. They trained Gaddafi also. The CIA referred to him as Hitler's chief of Eastern intelligence. Mr. Otto Skorzeny built up Nasser with Reinhard Gehlen and with Hallmar Schacht, and the whole network of Nazis from Heinrich Müller came in from Brazil, and a team of Nazis to train Nasser, train Sadat to kill Nasser, and were in charge of those operations. And this book, Nazi in Exile, Martin Bormann, goes into Colonel Gaddafi, who was set up by the Nazi Bormann Brotherhood, and he was to be in charge of Libya, and Nasser would get rid of Farouk, and they would have him in Egypt. Now, the fact that they use them temporarily just means that you slide them out. Their usefulness is over, and this is what happened with Squad 19 with Richard Nixon in 1972. If there were plans to kill him, and he'd been useful all the years, he's of more use dead, and more police control, say, under Spiro Agnew. So the fact that Gaddafi and Nasser worked with these teams doesn't mean it isn't time to murder and get them on their way. I also referred in 1981 to French Nazis that were backed by Gaddafi. That this came from the London Times, October 10th, 1980. Recent killings of the Paris synagogue bombing compared to European fascism in the 30s, and the links of the far right wing, the Nazi elements of Gaddafi in Europe, destabilizing Europe, being part of the team all along, as I say, until he's not usable anymore or can blackmail and carry on operations on his own if he gets too strong. The Los Angeles Times had an article, a brief comment, editorial by Dave Durenberger. He's the member from Congress, the Senate chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. It seems that he's been kind of knocked out, the wind knocked out of him. He's been opposing William Casey and the changes in the CIA. And he wrote a editorial type article, Democracy in an Age of Secrecy. And under the title is, Without Access to Vital Intelligence, How Can the People Decide? And he's saying the conflict as chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, because there's an air raid on Libya. Historic changes take place in the circumstances under which the United States commits its armed forces to combat. He said in the past, wars typically began in response to military assaults, like the German blitzkrieg against Poland, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. These events were tangible, unambiguous, and visible to all. But the times have changed. And of course, with William Casey from the OSS, the CIA, and the Knights of Malta, and being in charge, ruthlessly moving along like a bulldozer, there's no way to stop that man now. Dornberger doesn't speak of it in those terms, but he says the times have changed. A few days ago, we initiated major military operations against Libya in response to an intelligence report available only to a restricted number of government officials. And he as much as says, how do we know that this report is accurate? In 1962, we went to the brink of war with the Soviet Union based on intelligence reports concerning the Soviet missiles in Cuba. This reliance on the arcane and shadowy business of intelligence as the trigger for the use of U.S. military power has paralleled broader changes in the nature of international conflict. Traditional distinctions between war and peace have been superseded by the ambiguities of Cold War and the netherworld of state-backed terrorism. And he said the United States justified its bombing of a Libyan target by referring to Gaddafi's history of support of terrorism. More specifically, the president cited Libyan culpability for a Berlin discotheque and such operations. But the fact of the Berlin bombing was undeniable. However, the irrefutable evidence of Libyan responsibility for this and other planned attacks rested entirely on intelligence reports. The public and the press have no independent means of confirming the accuracy of those reports or whether they were subject to anybody else's interpretation. He said what is required is a renewed sense of trust in our elected leaders that democracy thrives on healthy skepticism. And if you are working on the report of these people and not getting the facts to a lot of people to make a decision about who is the enemy or what we are doing, we're in trouble. He said the real issue is the United States foreign policy and security policy is increasingly dependent on intelligence that must by nature remain secret. Now take the example of the Grenada invasion, when we were told by Caspar Weinberger that the Soviet Union was putting in a huge airstrip for taking over the Caribbean, and it was an absolute lie. He showed it to us in March of '83, and it wasn't that at all. And that was a justification for striking there and then bombing a hospital and not telling who was in there or what happened and secretly getting rid of those corpses and saying no press could come around for 2 or 3 days. So Dave Dornberger, Senator Dornberger, is asking about a democracy in the age of secrecy, and for all purposes, the democracy is over. There's no such thing. I've warned for years that the National Security Council tells the president, and security is what they or the corporations or the multinational drug dealers think they want. It has no basis upon fact or the fact of how Gaddafi became a terrorist in the first place. Now, there was a murder in Lebanon this week, reaction to the strike at Libya, and the San Jose Mercury, had an article, Bay Area native thought he was in no danger. Peter Colburn said his library job made him immune to Lebanon's violence. Now, I wonder, what is the criteria of you listeners out there, or your friends, or your family, or your public officials? Everybody sits back on their can and thinks, I'm immune. I'm not a political person. I'm not interested in politics. And then the article tells he thought he was immune because he wasn't very much. He was just a librarian. Okay, the president bombs Gaddafi's home. The Muslims get angry, and some faction of them, and they kill this librarian. And nobody, the reason I bring it up is that nobody is immune each one is responsible for himself, and to be intelligent, and the facts of Lebanon that he should be helping change have been out long enough before he was kidnapped, and it's a fallacy to think, I'm only a librarian, I don't know what's going on. Now, another person that was killed on that raid was a Captain Paul F. Lawrence, who bombed Libya, one of the two that didn't come back in the airplane. And the San Francisco Chronicle had an article today, fund set up for son of flyer killed in raid. A trust fund was set up for the 8-month-old son of Captain Lawrence, the Navy flyer presumed dead, who was killed in a raid on Libya. The gentleman setting up the fund is State Senator Ed Davis of Chatsworth, who's running for Senate of the United States this year. Now, I mentioned Ed Davis last week, broadcast 749, because he ran Squad 19, the group with G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, and James McCord that planned to kill Richard Nixon in 1972. And I mentioned how this Rafael Eitan, Dirty Harry, who works for Permindex, was in San Diego in 1972, and the assassination teams were in place, in fact, for a coup for killing the President of the United States. And Ed Davis was chief of police in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was murdered, and he was chief of police when he let the Aryan nations, the Nazis, out, and Mr. Richard Butler's friend, Thane Caesar from Lockheed, and he was in charge of the prison riots and the famous murder of George Jackson, the trial that's going on now with Stephen Bingham as head of the LAPD, and their links through criminal conspiracy section up to California. So Ed Davis is concerned about the 8-month-old son of the person killed on the raid, and he also is running for office, national office, as one of our senators, and he is a man that should literally be hung up like Mussolini, except that he keeps working up politically and nobody goes back to the crimes of the past. And it's the crimes of the past, as you see very clearly in the news today, and for those who particularly have followed me through the years, that they're coming to a head right now. Now, in East Germany, President Erich Honecker was speaking to the Congress there, the 11th East German Congress of the Communist Party, and Mr. Gorbachev was visiting, attending that, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he said at this presentation that the attack against Libya could lead to a new world war. It would certainly not only harm the East and West relationships, but it was, he felt, the opening gun probably to World War III, that it was the key issue of his speech. He said these were imprudent actions that could lead to a catastrophe that could plunge humanity into an inferno of a new world conflict from which there will be no return. The U.S. attack will unavoidably have a negative effect. Now, he is saying it could lead to a catastrophe. You've heard those words on the shuttle memos. They knew that several years ago, certainly 1984, 1982, that certain conditions would lead to a catastrophe. But what these people don't understand is it's a catastrophe that is wanted to happen. That is the purpose of our debt, our goals, our placement of weapons. It is that. The East-West relations are important. The banks are collapsing. The scandals won't go away. The Lehman Doctrine, John Lehman, Secretary of Navy, has stated clearly how he will begin World War III. Caspar Weinberger, George Shultz, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan are all part of the Permindex operation. They will use security from terrorism as their excuse for World War III. And as I cited last week, Reagan is groomed with the biblical prophecy that first you attack Libya and then the other Arabs respond and stir the kettle that will cause the Armageddon and the attack against the Soviet Union. As I say, there's a coup plan for Egypt to get Mr. Mubarak out, and the chronology of these people through the years has been very consistent. So, yes, indeed, President Erich Honecker of East Germany is right. It could lead to a world war, but following history, that's exactly what they want. The L.A. Herald had a story this week. Senator Leader Robert Dole, Majority Leader, proposes legislation that would waive the War Powers Act. And he wants the president to order military action. This War Powers Act was put in 1973, where the president had to consult with Americans in order to send, with Congress, in order to send Americans into war. But if you kill an American librarian in Lebanon, you already say, hey, Congress, Americans are being killed. And following this weak cable message out of Berlin nightclub, the flimsiest excuse for what is being flamed and started off, Dole then uses that provocation to state we want the War Powers Act. And furthermore, he says he wants the situation changed where the president would have the right to do political assassinations. The man already bombed Gaddafi's house, and it used to be covert murder. The United States needs permission to do murders, like Adolf Hitler needed permission to do murders. The whole thing is ridiculous. We are now at the stage in 1986 where take away the War Powers Act, we'll send Americans anywhere we want, and they're ready to send the special forces, the berets, into Nicaragua, and take away the restraints, because then you have to have the Rockefeller Committee, the CIA, the Senator Church Committee, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. It costs so much time and money to lock up stuff. Just say, we can kill anyone we want, and let's go on with it. And this is exactly where the administration is now, and that's where they started when I first went on the air 15 years ago, starting my 16th year now. This is exactly what they were building up. Now, this last Saturday, there was an article, Ronald Reagan denies he tried to kill Gaddafi. He said yesterday the bombing raid on Libya, this was the 19th, wasn't to kill Gaddafi, but the administration was making jokes Thursday, and they said they would have hit the jackpot had Gaddafi been killed. We hope we would get rid of him, the Washington Post quoted one official as saying, but they weren't sure where he would be that night. America just has no desire, and I just want to reemphasize this maybe every week, no desire to sit and talk about any one of these problems. Those people that are in place in the White House, in the National Security Council, in the Pentagon, have no desire. They're there because they want war. That's all they want, and if they want it, they're going to get it. And then they quoted Bernard Kalb saying the United States is not trying to kill Gaddafi. As we said many times, we're trying to stop his support for terrorism. Now, Bernard Kalb was the pathological liar who put out the white paper for NBC saying that Ajah was linked to the KGB, and this whole trial of the century fell apart. It was nothing but a lie, but he influenced people by saying that the Soviet Union was behind the plans to kill the Pope, to kill a holy man from Poland. It was Bernard Kalb who says we don't want to kill him or overthrow him even, but stop your terrorism. And Bernard Kalb is the protege and co-anchorman with his brother of Henry Kissinger and Kissinger Associates through all of his media life. And Kissinger has killed Salvador Allende and Orlando Letelier, and we don't have to go through 3,000 murders of Mr. Diem or Mossadegh or JFK. Just run them all down. Kissinger Associates. So Mr. Kalb says we don't want to kill him. Who in the world would leave a liar like Bernard Kalb or Marvin Kalb, his brother, the spokesman for the Pentagon? Now, in 1981, July 27th, there were headlines, plans to kill Gaddafi. Casey is in trouble over reported plans to kill Gaddafi. And if you don't have these, you can go to your library and look up the date. CIA Director William Casey stepping up his fight to keep his job, faces a new controversy over the CIA plan that he approved to topple strongman Muammar Gaddafi. Now, in 1981, they want to kill Gaddafi. From 1976 to 1981, till Ronald Reagan was president, the CIA, the Pentagon, the Marines trained Gaddafi. Then they want to come in and take the oil and take that northern tip of the Mediterranean, the southern part of the Mediterranean, the North Africa. And Casey kept his job. He was planning this covert action. And, of course, Casey, being the director of the CIA, has a history going way, way back. And peaks of it came out at the time of Watergate. And this memo from the Intelligence Committee was spread around, and there were lots of pages telling about his plans to murder Gaddafi. It had nothing to do with the provocateur action of the Berlin nightclub. This was put in the drawing board till after Ronald Reagan's re-election, and maybe to stop any other elections because he always wanted to be commander-in-chief, but the plans to kill Gaddafi with William Casey go way, way back. And the provocations now are to create the situation to kill Gaddafi at this time and take over the oil and the property and the multinationals, the businesses set up by Peter Drucker could achieve what they want by literally grabbing the land, by making him become a terrorist, and then taking the country that they developed, the oil companies and so forth. Now, Jack Anderson had an article in 1981, The Assassination Game, that if you go on and provoke the situation, then in turn Ronald Reagan would be killed and you could blame Gaddafi. I'll take a 1-minute break and go back to that concept. If you keep goading them, you can get Ronald Reagan off this time with a better than John Hinckley job. And then George Bush of the CIA, who had Task Force 157 with Henry Kissinger and Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple, would be running the White House and directing what they did from private offices before they went into the Oval Office. As I say, I'll take a 1-minute break and go back to many of the implications of the Libyan conflict. This is Mae Brussell. It's side 2 of broadcast number 750. I hope you tape this while I'm on the air. That's why I take that 1-minute break, so that you can turn your tape recorder over and then you can play these back for years to come, I hope. Jack Anderson wrote in 1981 about the plans to kill Gaddafi. He wrote many articles on it. He said the CIA still has their eyes cast towards Gaddafi, that there have been whispers slipping around of an assassin slipping into Libya to do away with Muammar Gaddafi. Now, I've often thought that while Jack Anderson writes very wonderful things, he also serves as an agent provocateur, and anybody from Libya could read this if they didn't read the other articles about William Casey. At the time of Watergate, it turned out that Frank Sturgis, the anti-Castro Cuban that worked with Squad 19, with E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord and so forth, was a lifelong friend of Jack Anderson's and a supplier of information to Anderson, and he also has believed to have been at Dealey Plaza. Many people think that Sturgis was, in fact, one of those tramps and was involved in the murder of John Kennedy. And, of course, Jack Anderson will never touch the investigation of John Kennedy. Now, at the time that Kennedy was murdered, Robert Mayu of the CIA was working with John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, and it became an open secret, such as the secret to kill Gaddafi, that the CIA was going to kill Fidel Castro. So when the CIA arranged the murder of John Kennedy, they blamed Castro because he thought they were going to kill him first. And even Henry Hurd in 1986, just this past month, is touring around the country saying that Fidel Castro had the most reason to kill John Kennedy. So by planning the murder of Gaddafi, talking about it, and so forth, Jack Anderson did bring up the subject. He said, there's one bugaboo that troubles thoughtful strategists. Assassination is a game that anyone could play, and I had this way back on broadcast 509, that's a long time ago, about 4 years ago, and he said killer squads could come and ambush Ronald Reagan in retaliation for his wanting to kill Gaddafi. So as I said before, what better way for CIA George Bush, CIA director, to get rid, or the people to get rid of Ronald Reagan, who's making a lot of mistakes, and I'll do more about the David Stockman book in weeks to come, but beware now that a lot of exposés of Reagan are coming out that can break down everything he's done, which deserves to be broken down, but get ready for a new administration under Vice President George Bush. Now, this past week, the news media has been trying to link the Soviet Union to the network of terrorism. So then you ask yourself, you go one more state. If Gaddafi is responsible for terrorism, and we set him up and taught him all these ways and taught him, and now he has to be knocked down, is the next person then going to be the Soviet Union? It's not going to be Libya, and it's not going to be Iran, but we're working towards that war against the Soviet Union. Now, Reverend Moon's paper with editor Arnaud de Borchgrave has a large front-page story. William Casey of the CIA links Gorbachev to network of terrorism. The important thing is that he's telling people that Mr. Gorbachev is trying to solidify a network of terrorists all around the world to subvert the world, the free world, while we are doing the drug dealing and subverting ourselves. And he says they're using Syria and Libya to sabotage the Middle East, and yet we've done everything, and you can't do in 1 hour, all the mistakes we've made in the Middle East to sabotage ourselves. It's the thinking and blaming the Soviet Union as we foul up every area that we touch, that they are responsible for the mix-up, and that the terrorism and the poverty and the collapse of the banks and the starvation and the diseases coming are therefore from the Soviet Union. The San Francisco Examiner has a story, U.S. assails Soviet role in crisis. The Reagan administration, stung by cancellation of summit planning talks, lashed out at the Soviet Union for lack of progress. And they put off some of these talks because of the events taking place in Libya. Well, the people in the Soviet Union must be equally as smart as somebody like Mae Brussell, who's fairly ignorant, to figure out how this provocation has been going on. And Bernard Kalb, again, from the Pentagon, saying, we've wasted 6 months since the summit. Well, nothing was done at the summit. We were supposed to talk about arms reduction. The president says, I'll never barter Star Wars. There's really no more to say if you're not going to give up some of the things that you want in order to have world peace, which they don't want. And the LA Times has a story by Norman Kempster. U.S. ties Soviet inaction on terror to raid. And again, they are blaming the Soviet Union and Mr. Bernard Kalb and so forth, that they're not doing anything, and they're the cause of the friction, and they put themselves in a pretty big box, and they have to figure out what to do as far as the summit goes, and talking about weapons, that they're not cooperating. And there's so much double talk in all of these articles. I just cite 3, and there's many more. But in the minds of the American people, if you have problems, if you can't travel, if the traveling is off, if the librarian is killed, if a pilot is killed flying over there, it's all the Soviets' fault. And now that they're going to be ready to squash Gaddafi, they're moving on to Russia, which is what Ronald Reagan did when the Korean airline went down. And the investigations of those things follow quietly and take many years and a long time. But the rhetoric stays in the mind, just as Hitler's rhetoric about the various countries that he plowed through. Now, this past week, there was an article, U.S.-German Accord on Star Wars is leaked. It didn't leak. The United States brought over the space scientists from Peenemünde, the Project Paperclip people, to make Star Wars. There are so many thousands of books on the weapons in space. In my own library, I have many, many books, of maybe 100, on the weapons in space and Star Wars, and the main one, Project Paperclip, that came out by Clarence Lansby. But the text of the accord wasn't just leaked. They're saying maybe it was a possible act of treason. The Star Wars Accord was signed March 27th by Caspar Weinberger and West German Economics Minister Martin Bangmann. Now, that is a day of infamy that you can put down that will affect all of your lives, and in our lifetime, we will be sorry that this kind of thing happened. But this is the goal of all of the activity. The accord with Germany and Star Wars has been a continuous love affair between Germany, German bases, Nazis, the CIA, the National Security Council, the Pentagon and Air Force and Marines and Navy, and every branch of our armed services, and the ultimate is to control the world through the heavens. Newsweek and various newspapers are reviewing David Stockman's book, and I'll do more on it later, The Fatal Flaws of the Reagan Revolution. But the important thing about the book is that, just reading the reviews of it and a few comments, is that he left the Office of Management Budget because Ronald Reagan ran to balance the budget, and he realized, and this is the important thing about the warfare state, he realized that there was going to be nothing but money for weapons. He said George Shultz and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger were concerned with minutiae of U.S. involvement in Lebanon, and he said they were concerned with weapons. He had the greatest contempt for Weinberger. There were incessant demands, and his goal was budget equilibrium, and he wanted to keep a handle on the weapons. But he said there were weapons increases that just went out of hand, and Weinberger had no discernible plan other than weapons are better. Now, don't get too excited about David Stockman, even though he has a few nasty things, and I'm sure more in his book about Alexander Haig. He went to work for Salomon Brothers, which is a client of Kissinger Associates, and the conflict of Haig and Kissinger versus Schultz and Weinberger, the competition of the East, the Bechtel group, versus the Eastern one, is very important. Stockman was paid to go into the offices of Salomon Brothers and then got $2.5 million for a book by Harper and Row and $1 million to be under the clutches of Henry Kissinger and Kissinger Associates and Solomon. So this isn't a great liberal pointing out the problems in the system. It's somebody maybe preparing the way for Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger to be president or chief of staff or secretary of defense and pushing them to the brink. It'll be interesting to read more about the book, but the gist I got from what I could see was his anger that Schultz and Weinberger had no hold on the weapons, that anything you had in the way of weapons was better. There was no plan, and that it offended him that he couldn't stop the amount of waste and the weapons that they wanted. And that, again, goes back to the whole idea that this is a warfare state, and the weapons are necessary because they have a goal maybe by 1988, the way it's escalating now, and before the next elections, possibly to get us into the brink of a World War III. Now, William Pfaff, who's a representative of the LA Times in Paris, wrote an article for the LA Times, "America throws a tantrum. Getting Gaddafi is a selfish catharsis, not a cure for terrorism." And again, I might cite that these people are missing the point. There is not an interest in a cure for terrorism. We have trained them so that we can respond to them. And the article says that Washington is a city that thinks about one thing at a time. Right now it is terrorism. Thinking is the wrong word for what they do. What is happening is less intellectual than visceral. A violent emotional response is taking place to attacks upon Americans abroad. Now, if Mr. William Pfaff would go back to 1972, when Black Abductor was written, and incidentally, that's when Mr. Rafael Eitan was in San Diego with the Permindex group, a book was written about the kidnapping of an American heiress whose relatives, father, grandfather, were publishers, and that she would be taken by a motley group of terrorists, and it was the exact script from an office never seen, a printer never seen, for the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, that escalated the SWAT teams in America, that escalated domestic terrorism for Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese in 1972 out of San Diego, when I was referring last week to the Eitan connections to Permindex in San Diego. Anybody who would study Leo Cherne, who's on the Foreign Advisory Intelligence Board, and his role to the SLA and the Defense Department and the CIA Defense Department, would know that the beginning and building up of terrorism was planned, where right now the attack, as I say, on Gaddafi is not a response to it. It is something, the SWAT team didn't come in necessarily to respond to the kidnapping of Patty Hearst or the taking of some minutia at a little department store in L.A., some socks or something that triggered off finding these people. It was so small when it was burning 6 people alive for what had actually taken place, and Patty Hearst was alive. These things are on the drawing board. So Mr. Pfaff from Paris, I guess I pronounced his name, P-F-A-F-F, says that Washington is in deep resentment that other governments won't accept the American case, that Gaddafi's responsible for the Berlin nightclub. Well, maybe the other governments are studying and understanding what agent provocateurs are and can't jump into the scene, even though the people on the streets were interviewed that it was just wonderful action. He said the Reagan administration has by now convinced itself beyond all argument that the answer to its terrorist problems lies in doing something about Gaddafi. And I mentioned 2 weeks ago on broadcast 746 that part of the training of Ronald Reagan was the biblical prophecy, the Falwells, the Powell Robertsons, and those kind of people, that by taking Gaddafi in Libya, it would trigger this Middle Eastern conflict that would then bring the Armageddon and the war against Russia. So definitely the problem is in Gaddafi, because that's the button that you hit to get the proper responses that you want. But he doesn't understand or study history to realize, and nobody publishing these kinds of editorials even thinks along these lines. He says this bombing over in Libya represents another disastrous triumph of the American image-making machine, the star system, applied this time to international politics. Well, the image-making machine has to do with Pope John Paul II at Auschwitz, who took acting, or it has to do with Evita Peron, who was an actress, or Ronald Reagan, who was an actor, if you can call him that. The star system is definitely in, and it was built up as an image while the war machine rolled on. He said, not only does Ronald Reagan hold this view, but Senator Edward Kennedy, leader of the Democratic Liberals, said in Congress, this is a quote, and you can be very ashamed of Ted Kennedy. Right after the bombing, he said, get all Libyans expelled from Europe, get all economic ties cut between Western Europe and Libya. European forces should join American naval demonstrations off Libya. The Europeans have had a free ride for too long in the struggle against terrorism. Now, I would love Senator Ed Kennedy to get on a stand and say under oath whether or not he attended with Aristotle Onassis and Jacqueline Onassis the burial in 1971 of a body of Howard Hughes off a Greek island that was dumped into the water in those time periods. Who is Ted Kennedy, and what do they have on him and his various activities? And how can a man who comes out as a liberal stand there and tell you to expel every Libyan from Europe? I would like to go through the newspaper articles of 1979, 1980, 81, and see when Ted Kennedy said anything about the Turple, Wilson, Carlos connections to Gaddafi, to the CIA people arming Gaddafi. Has he ever asked for Robert Vesco? Does he ask where Frank Turple is? Where is Senator Kennedy into the real role of terrorism in the Middle East? Or George Habash, who sets up these fronts that work, sure, with Gaddafi, but work with the CIA and Mr. Pinochet from Chile? When did Senator Edward Kennedy become an expert on getting rid of Libyans in Europe? This article, continuing just from the LA Times story, it says Europeans can't bring themselves seriously to believe the simplicities that are proclaimed here. And this man is writing from Paris, William Pfaff. They can't bring themselves seriously. Well, they've gone through the Bologna bombing. They've gone through the terror through the years. They've gone through the Red Brigades and the Baader-Meinhof. They know that Carlos worked with the intelligence communities. They know that actions have taken place that weren't as they appeared to be. Even they can remember things like the Gulf of Tonkin or the Reichstag fire. And he cites from Paris that 1 American was killed and 204 were injured, 64 of them Americans, and Germany has more than twice the reasons to be concerned over the bombings in Berlin, but they weren't. And he said many in Washington are dismayed by Reagan's obsession with Gaddafi. Now, it's one thing to be dismayed by the obsession about Gaddafi, but as Senator Durnberg said, we're reacting on a gut level of liars with a past record of lying, telling us something happened, and going on that for the invasion of Grenada, not going into it, going on that for going in and bombing Libya. We are using liars like Mr. Bernard Kalb and the Pentagon and the media, mass media, and justifying things that are pulling us like quicksand into this quagmire of never-ending hell on earth with bombings and wars and moving people and displacing people. And we're doing it by people who are sick mentally, who have a track record going back to the past war, who have been part of all the political assassinations that have come down the pike, and continue to fester the planet Earth with their diseased mentality and bring so much harm. And what will get the people in Europe behind attacking Gaddafi and so forth will be some more confrontations set up by some more provocateurs. And I'm not saying that Gaddafi isn't a terrorist, and I'm not saying Mr. Nasser isn't, or that Sadat, who is trained along with Gaddafi for getting rid of Nasser and Farouk before them, these heads of states are mean. But Ronald Reagan sat on the Rockefeller Committee and lied about the murder of John Kennedy, and the CIA assassination plots have told enough terrorism just in our own congressional records to show that we are terrorists and murderers and attempted murderers, and we use chemicals and food poisoning and every kind of a weapon to kill heads of states. And even Senator Dole is asking for permission to kill. Just give me the right to say we can kill anyone we want, because up till now they did it anyway. And it's the hypocrisy that really galls me about this whole thing. One isn't perfect, but I think we have trained these terrorists and given them the means to do it, and we have no right to take a political dictatorship in our own country because they respond to a way than when we goad them and attack them. Now, regarding the raids, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, 3 past presidents, were interviewed. Carter said the raids were wrong. He didn't like bombing innocent people. But he sent his brother over with Mr. Gaddafi to be very much a part of the assassination teams, and he's worked for Permindex and Lockheed out of Atlanta, Georgia, and he was part of the 912 black people, mainly black at Jonestown, who were never identified as victims of the CIA, of drug experimentations, mind control. He doesn't like to see innocent people killed, so on the record he says, no, I don't want it. Gerald Ford said we did exactly the right thing. That's the president from the Warren Commission, who was appointed by a crook to be the president until Ronald Reagan came in. And Nixon said he had no comment, which is really funny because he wants to be the elder statesman and he doesn't want anything to do with it. And Jimmy Carter is saying that he thought it was wrong to kill Gaddafi's adopted daughter, that if anyone had killed Amy, he would have been so angry that he would retaliate. It would have hurt him so much if 17 years ago someone had killed Amy. Well, is Amy any more precious than the children at Jonestown? If she is, let me know how or why he took name tags off of the people and put them in common graves and didn't even have decent burials. Now, last week I was talking about the scandal of Kuwait Petroleum and the indictment of Darius Keaton out here in Pebble Beach, and the fact that Gerald Ford stayed at the home that was owned by Charter Oil Company out here, involved with the Kuwait Santa Fe oil, the scandal of the United States firm of Santa Fe that was taken over by Kuwait Petroleum. And I briefly mentioned a few factors of Gerald Ford and his relation to Charter Oil and cited the references on that. But going on to Libya, there is a network of Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford's Charter Oil, and they all combine. It has less to do with political parties than it has to do with money and big bucks in the Middle East, and that is something that people don't really understand. It hasn't got to do with Reagan, a Republican, or Carter, a Democrat. As a matter of fact, in the Executive Intelligence Review, there was a wonderful summary several years ago in 1980 of the Billy Gate oil connections, Jimmy Carter's connections, and it cites the politics of Jimmy Carter, the president, in the fall of 1978. That was 1.5 years after we started training and arming Gaddafi to be a terrorist, and that's when the Camp David Accords took place and a summit meeting between President Carter and Anwar Sadat and Mr. Menachem Begin, the Israeli president. And the second thing was the Iranian Revolution when the Shah was out, and the third was Billy Carter going to Rome and meeting with people in Atlanta, Georgia, and with Michelle Papa, who is part of the Permindex operation that I've cited before, and the activities and the floating around of the brother of the President of the United States with these various agents from British intelligence and from the CIA and the Permindex operation, and involved with Muammar Gaddafi through all these years. Not only was Billy Carter going to Libya, but Robert Vesco was going there, and Vesco was turning over information to Orrin Hatch. He's not a Democrat, he's a Republican. They're provocateurs, and Robert Vesco was setting up situations for a company called Charter Oil Company with Billy Carter. Charter Oil Company owns the home that Gerald Ford stays with at Pebble Beach, and not to confuse you too much, but the right and left, as I say, switch back and forth. And there's an article here on the Vesco link to down to the Caribbean, to the Charter Oil Company, and also the oil that would come in from Libya that Billy Carter made an offer. He was supposed to get $25 million to get Libyan oil into an embargo-free trade situation with Libyan friends, Charter Oil, and Governor Kerry of New York. And this all was going on. These scandals were occurring in 1980, and again, you can go to the library and look up the story of Billy Carter, Michelle Papa, a mafioso person from Permindex, and the top people of the mafia and the industrial world and prominent people were dealing with Libya, with the oil companies, trying to get tax benefits in the Caribbean. And Charter Oil, again, owned by Gerald Ford's friend here, not owned all of it by him, but a good hunk of it involved with Gerald Ford and Mr. Darius Keaton. The Middle East is a question of oil money, oil profits, and as that oil gushes, or you want the profits, you can get rid of the leaders. There's nothing to that, and you keep the money flowing. There's an article by Scott Thompson in 1980 in Executive Intelligence Review, citing over the past month, a major scandal involved the charter company and the Carter administration and the use of the president's brother Billy Carter to secure embargoed free oil from his Libyan friends for a Bahamian refinery that the charter company purchased in the spring of 1979 from Kerry Energy. In exchange, Charter offered Billy Carter this huge commission, and it goes on to say that in 1978, Billy Carter made his first visit to Libya with Raymond Mason, the chairman of Charter Oil, and it was the first of 6 negotiations with financier Robert Vesco. Now, I've mentioned Ernest Kaiser, Ernest von Kaiser from the Wehrmacht, who works with our CIA, who was shot in February 1985 and went to Bonn, Germany, and he at that time was going to bring in Robert Vesco for a judge in Florida and get some good rewards, and he also knew where Joseph Mengele was that year. And I cited the fact that Ernest Kaiser worked with Mr. Eitan, and Rafi, Dirty Harry, dirty nickname, the Israeli intelligence, the co-partner of Mr. Sharon, and they not only work in the United States but all over the world. And Vesco was a person that was wanted by various people and is still out loose with Frank Turple doing his activities, and Billy Carter was visiting with these people in return for favors for Libya and the oil companies. And by November 1978, the National Oil Company of Libya filed suit for $170 million that Mr. Kerry owed him on back oil shipments from Kerry Energy. And in 1979, Ahmed Shahadi, the unofficial foreign minister of Gaddafi's Arab Socialist Union, and met with the Libyan ambassador to Italy, and they got together in Rome with Raymond Mason of Charter Oil and Jimmy Carter's family. Billy Carter was involved with the Charter Oil and with people very important to the multinational corporations. So Gaddafi isn't separate from them. As a matter of fact, the ownership of Charter stock, if you look it up, Raymond Mason of Charter stock, one of the big stockholders of that company is St. Joe's Paper Company, which is the largest stockholder. It's controlled by Alfred I. DuPont Trust, and the chief executive is Ed Ball, who is groomed to be the current charter company chairman, along with Raymond Mason and Kerry Energy, as I say. And the American Financial Corporation is another large company owning stock in Charter, and it's run by Max Fisher, and I'll do more about Max Fisher next year, and he's a partner of Robert Vesco and the Caribbean Cocaine and Marijuana Group, and he also is chairman of United Brands, the old United Fruit, and holding a big interest in that country is the company is the American Financial Corporation, run by Sean Eisenberg from Israel. So that the big bucks of oil and contacts and working with Gaddafi through all these years, 1976, 77, 78, 79, had to do with agents of Sir William Stevenson and Canadian financier E.P. Taylor. And I'm citing some names that are in this study of the people from Georgia with Jimmy Carter and Billy Carter in the middle of all this network of the Charter Oil that's close to the activities, to the murder of Sadat, to Kuwait, now the planned murder of Gaddafi, which was on the drawing board all along. And the territory is what they want, the oil, the ocean, and the territory. And in order to take it, we can't be aggressive if we just slap our friends. So we have to set them up with the means to become terrorists, so we have an excuse then to slap them. That's exactly, as I said, what agent provocateurs are. And Frank Turple and Robert Vesco and the floating agent provocateurs of William Casey's early network with the Security Exchange Commission, with the investment overseas, with Bernie Cornfeld. You have to get a lot of books on Watergate to look up these names, or books on Cornfeld and Mr. Crosby, Harry Crosby, I mentioned last week, who died from Resorts International, was part of this team down in the Bahamas with Cornfeld and Vesco. And Vesco's early money in Cornfield's was sponsored by Edmund Rothschild and the DuPonts and so forth. So when the multinationals come in as huge blocks, they set up their people for certain activities and advise them what to do. And then the big corporations come in then and own the oil, own the land, and can keep it for themselves. And when the heads of states don't behave, such as Ferdinand Marcos, you select the next person to take over. But the one thing that is sure is that you own the profit of these countries, and that's the purpose of the game, is the particular profits. There was an article in the New York Post that I've had for a long time and might have cited before about a meeting at a Super Bowl game at which Clint Murchison was talking to Billy Carter, trying to set up a deal to sell Libya air defense system. This was in 1980, setting up an air defense system. Now, an example of the way the business works is that this week there was an article. Schultz says one goal of the attack was to overthrow Gaddafi, a large article in the New York Times by Bernard Wertzman, by George Shultz, and Secretary of State, that we're going to overthrow Gaddafi. And there are also documents to show how the United States planned to overthrow the Philippines, and I'll detail those for you later. But the point is that after we got Mr. Marcos out of the Philippines, the Americans arranged it, and they had selected Corazon Aquino as the logical one to take over. She meets with Caspar Weinberger, and George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger, as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, are the top officers of a company named Bechtel Corporation. So just leaving Libya for one moment, the San Francisco Chronicle, April 19th, says, April the 8th and 9th, Caspar Weinberger's in the Philippines. And the 19th, it says, Bechtel sees big potential in the Philippines. The Bechtel Group has quietly begun talks with the Philippines about helping rebuild the country's industrial plans to make it the first big U.S. company to check in now that Marcos' regime is out. I'll go back to this next week, but it's very important that Bechtel of Weinberger and Schultz step right in and get the money, and the banks give them the loans, and their corporations make the money, and they're making the foreign policies, then bringing the profit to the corporations that are also intelligence covers. And that, again, it's the oil and the drugs that are important. The people can be killed. They're expendable. It's the tangible bucks that you spend to keep the economy going is what's causing these problems. But the time is out now. I threw a lot in at the last moment. I'll go back to Bechtel in the Philippines, compare it to Lydia, and do some more with you next week. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be in touch with you. Thanks for your books and articles and letters. I'll answer as soon as I can.